Happy New Year! It's December 25th, 2025, but in the Crown of Aragon, 639 years ago, well, it was also December 25th, but it was 1387, the first day of 1387 in the Crown of Aragon. In that time period, people celebrated New Year's Day on Christmas. The year changed on December 25th. Welcome to Season 1 of the Historian's Notebook. My name is Jonathan Seyfried, and I am a PhD candidate in history at the University of New Mexico. The Historian's Notebook takes you on a journey through the research process that historians go through when they create historical narratives from what they read in the archives. It's part of being a historian that often becomes invisible by the time the research gets published in an article or book. This first season of the Historian's Notebook is titled Molt cara companiona, a phrase that translates to my dearest companion, or most dear companion. King Joan I of the Crown of Aragon frequently used this phrase in letters to his wife, Queen Violant de Bar. In this season of the Historian's Notebook, I'll tell you a little bit about a document closely connected to Joan and Violant, who lived in the late 14th century. The archive of the Crown of Aragon holds so many documents that we can look at one for every day of their reign. Now let's begin. The document that I'm talking about today is dated December 25th, 1387, and as the very beginning of today's podcast explained, well, this was New Year's Day. Letters or documents written on December 24th, they would have had the year listed as 1386. So Violant on New Year's Day wrote a letter to the officials, the most politically powerful officials in the city of Montpellier. And this is kind of on the outer edge of the territory of the Crown of Aragon. Montpellier was known for having a university that was at really the top of its class for medical knowledge. So there were a few cities in the late Middle Ages that were at the top of the list. Montpellier was one, Salerno was another. So Violant is writing this letter to the officials who are in charge of running Montpellier and I guess maybe like have some sway when it comes to criminal matters, because the content of the letter is about some students that got into trouble. Some students that are subjects of the Crown of Aragon, probably Aragonese. And this information alone brings up so much that needs to be explained in the background. But I'm gonna pause on talking about this particular letter for just a moment in order to give you a little bit of a groundwork on what the podcast is going to be like. So what's going to happen in this podcast is that some days I will go deep into the document and spend a whole lot of time with it. I mean, relatively speaking, these are going to be short, bite-sized episodes. Other times, I'm just going to talk about the document a little bit, maybe for about a minute, and then use it as sort of the tip of an iceberg for a lot of background knowledge that listeners will find helpful when trying to understand just, what is going on with the individual document, as well as the larger story of Joan and Violant, who began their reign as king and queen of the Crown of Aragon in 1387. So one thing about this document is that it is signed from the Duchess, because they didn't start their reign. Violant didn't become queen until something like January 6th or 7th. And there's some question marks about how the transition of power took place. But in the very first days of 1387, Violant was the Duchess of Girona, Joan was the Duke of Girona, and Joan's father, Pere, he dies on, it seems, January 5th. And so basically what we've got here in this moment, in these final days of Pere's reign, is a lot of anticipation, because he didn't die suddenly. The guy had been on the throne for 50 years. He's old, and he had been declining. He was pretty much on his deathbed for many weeks. And is Joan there with his father, as his father is on his deathbed? No. Joan and Violant are in Girona, quite a distance away from Barcelona, where Pere was dying. So this raises some questions, and there's some answers to those questions, which I will get to in due course. So I want to take a step back and just on day one of the podcast, explain a little bit about what is happening here. What's happening here is that I am taking the listeners through, you, my friend, through something like an initial sweep through the archive. When historians are taking on a new project, they'll go to an archive, or, maybe the archive they're not physically going to, but they're accessing it online, which is what's happening for me with this season. And they have some theories about what they might find. Sometimes just very general questions of curiosity, other times very specific, like, I think that there was an assassination. And they're going in and they're reading through a bunch of documents in order to try to find the material that will help them to support an interpretation or an argument about what happened in the past. So at this point in the process of constructing a historical narrative, the historian is going through and just kind of identifying what the documents are and generally what they say. They can't really take a ton of time to thoroughly analyze each and every document, because there's only so much time you have at this stage, and you might miss a really important one down the road if you use up all your time going deep into every single document you find at the beginning. But of course there's a balance, because maybe at the beginning you find something incredibly amazing. So it's that tension that you'll kind of see me working with as we go through the course of the year. So what's happening at this moment is going through and just taking some notes on each document every single day of that first year of Joan and Violant's reign. And as we know, starting technically before they became king and queen. So really going from December 25th, 1387 to December 24th, 1387. That sounds weird, but that is a total of 365 days. So, what's going to happen in the podcast is a variation. Sometimes the whole 15-minute episode will be about that one document, really going into a close reading. Other times it'll be all context. But something that is going to happen probably every single episode is that there's just going to be a ton of questions. There's no way when you're looking at a document for the first time that you can definitively reach conclusions about all the things you're wondering. At this stage, historians are gathering, they're engaging their curiosity, and they're keeping in mind a concept that Sam Weinberg calls the specification of ignorance. They're keeping in mind all the things that they do not know, both about the content of the letter and also about the larger context. So for this letter by Violant on December 25th, let me just list to you some questions that I came up with after reading it. What did the students do? Was it criminal? It seems so, but she doesn't say it. She refers to the situation as the case or a case. Does Violant have Montpellier in her portfolio or have particular jurisdiction over it? Or is this a region that Joan would also have equal authority over? How unusual was it for the Duke and Duchess of Girona to intercede on behalf of students who got into trouble in Montpellier and other places? Were the students connected to elite figures or friends of Joan and Violant? This is actually previewing something that is going to come up on January 2nd. Joan wrote a letter about these students too. What does the precipitating incident say about student identity or the student lifestyle in university towns in the late 14th century? How many Crown of Aragon subjects went to distant lands for university training? Were there physician training universities in Iberia at this time? It's something I don't know. Montpellier might be the closest one to the Crown of Aragon. How does Violant's imminent ascension to the throne shape the way that she writes this letter, the content or the tone of it? And did Joan intercede before Violant did? Did he intercede after? I don't know. It's part of the challenge of the way that the documents in the archive of the Crown of Aragon are organized and make things a little bit difficult to find. More on that in the coming episodes. So that's a set of questions, and it's by no means the end of my list of questions when it comes to just working with this one document. But it models for you what's going on as a historian encounters a document even at this stage of the initial sweep. At this point, you might be curious to take a look at the document that I'm talking about. Well, on my website, jonathanseyfried.net, I am going to post every single document that I discuss in this season of the Historian's Notebook. So head on over there and click on the Historian's Notebook link, and you'll be able to find not only an image of this letter, but also some notes on it and a few links. Especially if I cite a source, I'll put in a bibliography for that day's episode. So there's a lot to look at and a lot to think about as we dive into this sort of right in the middle. There's so many questions that I want to answer for you. And I could do like a 4-hour lecture about everything I know about Joan and Violant. But I don't know. I think it's going to be a little bit more fun to just dive right into the middle of things and sort of, as you go on, get more comfortable with this time and place and the people and their personalities. One last thing before I conclude today's episode. I wanted to address something that we started out with. New Year's Day. Because you might have thought, oh, well, that's kind of weird that New Year's Day was also Christmas, but, Christianity was a really big deal in that society at that time. That kind of makes sense. But I want to share with you that in different places at this time, in these centuries, the late Middle Ages, kind of talking about maybe generally 1200 to 1500s, the convention for the New Year was so weird because it varied. There were a lot of places in Western Europe that started the New Year in March, specifically on Annunciation Day, March 25th. Annunciation Day was the day that the angel Gabriel came down to Mary and said, "You're gonna have a baby." So March 25th was New Year's Day in a lot of places. And I'm just really happy that at least in the Crown of Aragon, at this time in 1387, New Year's Day was at least like somewhat close to New Year's that we have today on January 1st. Because otherwise it gets really confusing about like when you're trying to read a document knowing sort of which year it was and what came before and what came after. So chronology is tough when you start when you're reading something and the New Year starts on March 25th, as is the case in a lot of places. All right, well, that was a little funky fun fact for you about the Middle Ages. So many more of those on the way. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Historian's Notebook, the inaugural episode. This season, Season 1, Molt cara compagnona. If you are leaving with more questions than you arrived with, I have done my job. Remember, the motto of The Historian's Notebook is dissatisfaction guaranteed. Visit the website to see an image of today's document and additional show notes, and listen again tomorrow to hear about the next day in the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violant de Bar. In the meantime, take care.